So today's webinar, Residential Grading in Civil 3D, it's kind of building on Scott Mizak's previous webinar where he used parcels to do some lot layouts. Here's a little screenshot of some of what he had done last week. So we're going to be building on that. We're going to be taking that same example and doing some of the grading in that area. So today's webinar is going to be intermediate, maybe more to an advanced level even. We're going to be using a lot of different tools, and we're going to be going through quite a few different options here. So the focus of today's webinar is on workflow. So we'll be skipping some details, and what I mean by that is we're not going to make an alignment today, but we're going to use some of them. We're not going to make it a profile, but we're going to use some of them. I'll be skipping over some picks and clicks, but focusing again on the workflow and assembling and putting together different tool sets to accomplish residential grading. So one of the challenges, there's multiple different features to grade. We've got roads, we've got lots, we've got ponds, and all of these require a combination of different grading related tools. Below is just a list there. We've got alignments, profiles, we've got assemblies, we've got corridors, intersections, sites, feature lines, grading tools, and of course surfaces for our grading in Civil 3D. We're going to be using all of those today in a number of different combinations. So what's the right tool for the job? Well, when it comes to roads, most of us understand alignments, profiles, and corridors, of course. We're going to use the intersection tools briefly as well to demonstrate how those fit into this. And when it comes to lot grading and building pads, we're going to be looking at using feature lines and grading tools. And the same will be for ponds. Now there's a number of different combinations that you can use to put this stuff together. I train people on a number of different ways to do this. This is one example that I've had some recent clients had a lot of success with. So we're going to use all those different tool sets to kind of divide and conquer our entire development, and then we're going to work to create dynamic relationships between those features. So how do we link grading done by a corridor? How do we tie that into grading done by feature lines and grading tools? How would a change in a road profile, for example, how would that allow us to easily update the lot grading? So that's one of the things we're striving for in this webinar and in this example, is not just dropping in, say, a bunch of feature lines and then just adding them as break lines to a surface, but rather we want to make a more dynamic model. And to do that, we have to use a number of different tool sets. So what we're going to go through, we're going to spend most of the webinar in Civil 3D. And the outline is we're going to start with some references of an EG surface and alignments and some of the lot lines that Scott Mizak had done last week. We're going to reference that into our grading drawing. And we're going to grade some roads with corridors and intersections. Then we're going to grade the lots and the building pads with feature lines and grading tools. And then we'll grade, we'll have one pond in there. Then we're going to talk about merging all these surfaces, these different components, component surfaces together through pasting. Many of you are probably aware of that very invaluable tool in Civil 3D. And finally, we're going to point out along the way and at the end some of the dynamic relationships we've set up between these different components, be it the roads and the lots or the ponds and the lots or any number of things. So with that, we're going to jump into Civil 3D. And by the way, as we go through this, we will take some questions if we have time, though there's a lot I want to show you guys today. So if the time starts to get tight, we're going to hold off on taking questions live, and then we will address them at the end, or if it goes past 1, we will address them by contacting you guys individually. So feel free to submit questions. They may just not get answered right on the spot. So we're in a drawing here. What I have is X-referenced in a drawing with parcels in it, a bunch of lots laid out. Okay. Our focus today is going to be on this block right here. What I also have in here is data referenced alignments, and then I have some design profiles created right in this drawing as well. We also have an existing ground surface. You can see that in my prospector. I've turned that off right now. I'll show it briefly just so you can see the contours, but it gets a little bit too busy for what we want to show today. We've got a fairly simple surface, cropped. So I'll go ahead and turn that off. So our starting point, we have alignments and profiles, so we're jumping right into corridors. And what I always tell people is to try to start with the more complex areas of your road design, which is to start with intersections, for example. So we're going to start with the intersections. What it allows us to do is to be able to generate all the assemblies we need in these areas in between the intersections. Everything we might need to address in an intersection, that will pretty much cover everything we need in between it. And it also allows us to run the copy region command, which is pretty handy. So I'm going to start right up here with the intersection tool, create intersection, and we're going to go through these fairly quickly to create these intersections. So I'm going to take a primary road, crown maintain, go through next, and we're going to take default settings in here, which is 2% cross slopes and 12-foot wide lanes. And then I'm going to add this to an existing corridor I have in the drawing. I'm going to take these default assemblies. Okay, so we're not getting in the intersection tool a ton today. We're just utilizing it in an overall workflow. And I create an intersection, and that intersection comes in here. Okay. So one thing to note: the assemblies that we're using right here. If I go to a couple of viewports, let's go look at the assemblies we have in here. What I have is a basic lane, a curb, a boulevard, and a sidewalk, and then what I have attached here is this very simple generic link. And what this thing is it's basically it's link offset and slope, which is slightly different than link width and slope. Offset refers to the distance from the center line or from the assembly marking point. So 30 feet isn't the width, though that's how it will show on assembly view. When it actually builds in the corridor, it's going to only go out to 30 feet, which is our right-of-way in this case. So 30-foot right-of-way each side of the center line. So those are the assemblies we're going to be using. So we're not, in this case, we're not daylighting to existing ground or anything like that, because we have to tie into new lots that we're going to grade over here. So I'm going to run through that same process. We're going to create 2 more intersections. Sometimes this intersection won't find the intersection. Give it a try again here. Oh, I think I see the problem. I might be missing an alignment. Sorry about that. We'll just data shortcut that alignment in here. It's down here. And it's this alignment right here. There it is. There's our problem. And I'm guessing we don't have a profile, so let me make that profile quick. Throw in the existing ground. Create a profile view. We'll drop this over here. And we'll draw in a preliminary design profile as well. I guess we are going to cover profiles today. These were supposed to be done, but I think I had inadvertently deleted it when I was setting up the starting drawing. So we're draining out of that cul-de-sac back towards the intersection. The intersection tool, of course, will lock that profile to the primary profile. So let's give that another try. There it is. So again, taking the same default parameters, we're not focused on detailed designs, but again on workflow. So there's a second intersection, and I'll go ahead and make my third one down here. And this one I know I have both alignments in there, just got to get the right intersection. This will be the third one, adding it to an existing corridor. So we're adding these all to the same corridor, and I don't think I did that to this one. Let's delete that corridor, and we'll go in. If you guys didn't know this, you can delete a corridor if you meant to add it to an existing corridor, and you accidentally forgot to do that. You don't have to delete the whole intersection. You can delete just the corridor regions, and then come back here and recreate it. And now we can add it to that same corridor. So don't have to redo all the intersection parameters. There, so all one corridor. What I also had done ahead of time, just in the interest of saving some time, was to build a few regions and baselines over here where we're tying in. We've got previous webinars discussing how to do that, so I'm not going to cover that here. So in between here, we'll just use our basic copy region command. We'll copy a region from these intersections to match into this point over here. Okay. Nice little handy tool. One of our free tools we made in our sim tools is one I call corridor cleanup, and allows us to very easily and quickly strip targets out of regions. And this is handy when you're copying regions out of intersections. You often have a region that gets copied out and it's got all sorts of targets and things, and you don't want those in there. So you won't see a visual change, but targets are removed from there and we won't get errors and things like that. So let me go change the frequency of this as well. Let's dial down the frequency a little bit. Okay. So again, we're just modeling to the right of way. And I'll run that copy region command a few more times here. From there to there. And I want to show you a nice little trick here. If we make a number of regions like this, all of these want to have the same frequency and target settings, which is to have no targets basically. That match parameters option for corridors, if you guys have never used that, it works pretty nice in this situation. So I'll show you that here. We've got all these other regions here with frequency up too high. So I can pick this corridor again and say match parameters, and here's my source region. My destination regions are these three over here, and I can pick those and hit enter, and what that's doing is removing the targets because there were no targets in the first region, and it's also matching the frequency of it. So big time savers with some of that stuff. Those of you who haven't used 15 yet, nice viewport options. So there's our corridor, a basic corridor. Let's move on to the lots now, and we're going to focus on the building pads first. So what the building pads are going to look like, I've got a couple layers in here. I've got some basic polylines we're going to work with. And these represent just the front of the pad, so the rough grading building pad. And what we need is to turn these into feature lines and then to grade whatever the pad is going to look like. It might be a walkout pad, it might be a lookout, a number of different options. We'll do that in a second, but the first thing is we need to find elevations of these fronts of these pads relative to the roadway. And there's a number of options. There's some workflows out there about targeting the fronts of the pads, lots of things we can do here. What I'm a big fan of is only using corridors to that right of way, and then everything else is feature lines and grading tools. But we use the corridor to assign elevations to these feature lines. So if I want this pad to be roughly 4 or 5% up from the grade at right of way, I need to have some kind of grade to come up here so I could then assign elevations to this feature line. So what we're going to do, I've got some of these set up on my assemblies already. What I have is a whole bunch of link to mark point subassemblies on here. And right now I have the width zeroed out, but if I put the width at, say, 35, I get an extension there. And that's going to give me a rough starting grade wherever that front of pad lies. So if I extend those out, and then I come back to my corridor and I rebuild my corridor, I'm now going to have an extension from right away, those grades. So now I have an approximation of where my pad should be. So if I go and use a select similar option, grab all those fronts of pads, at least the majority of these, they're all going to fall right underneath that corridor surfaces. And this is going to give me an option for assigning a starting elevation for these pads. So I can pick all those. Those are the ones we're going to use. I'll go to create feature lines from objects. And since my last selection was all those polylines, I can now hit P for previous. That's an old AutoCAD command. And it'll grab all of those polylines and hit enter. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn these into feature lines. We're going to put them all in one site called block 1. So we're going to assign elevations. We're going to pull elevations from the corridor surface. That's the one that we just extended out there. Okay. So now I can go back to my assemblies and temporarily turn those off. Select similar subassemblies. We don't want that one, but all the other ones. And I can zero this out again. It allows me to be able to just turn that off and on again anytime I make a big change to my corridor. So now my corridor is back to right of way, and we have starting elevations for all these fronts of pads. Another little trick here. We need to look at these. We need to decide on elevations. It needs to be 922.5, and then maybe this one is 926.5, something to that nature. Use general line labels and set them up to call out the elevations at the endpoints of your feature lines. This is a really nice way. It's any kind of site grading, commercial grading you might be doing. You drop these on your feature lines, and then you can very easily be looking at and understanding what the grades are on these. So I'm going to pick these. I'm going to do a few of these. We're not going to be able to do all these lots like this. I'm going to do a handful of them, then I'm going to jump to another drawing. So if I pick a few of these, go to Elevation Editor, I can come in here. So 942.5, let's say this pad is going to be at 942. Okay. Very easily run through these. 946, we'll say that pad is at. So just a preliminary, nice whole number or half number starting point. I'll do one more here. Put that at 954, okay? Those labels update with it. Oops, 952, I guess I meant to do 954. There we go, 954. So labels are pretty handy. So from here, we're talking about grading the pads, not the whole lot yet, but just the pad. So what this looks like is using grading tools. So let's go up to our grading creation tools. I'm going to set the site to block 1, and we're going to make a grading group called block 1, and we'll also make a surface as well. So I'll hit OK. OK to that block 1 surface to be created. Those of you who use grading tools, some maybe you haven't, always let your grading group create the surface for you. You don't manually add grading objects or grading tool created feature lines to a surface. You don't do that manually. Let the surface be created through these settings, or that initial setting, automatic surface creation. So a grading tool surface should never have anything added to it, with the exception of perhaps an outer boundary or something like that. And I've got a criteria set in here called residential grading, and I've got some defined gradings in here. So this front, for example, if I look at this one, what this does is it locks down a 20-foot distance to grade at a 0%. And it's all locked down, so it doesn't prompt me for it. So this is all about workflow. How do you make this quick and easy and efficient? And what it allows me to do is pick on these feature lines and very easily put that front flat pad on there. Okay. And then let's say some of these are lookouts over here. And perhaps this one is a walkout. Okay. So what I'm creating so far, if I take a look at this in 3D, it's just the building pads. We'll worry about the areas to fill in between in a moment, but we're just looking at the building pad. So there's that flat top of the pad. There's a walkout, rough grading, and these are lookouts over here. Okay. A number of other options you would have as well. You might have some deep lots, any number of things. You can create grading criteria for that and put it right in a grading criteria set and very easily grab those and attach those. And the beauty of using grading objects for this is that at any point I can move this pad up or down. For example, this is at 951. I can do a raise lower up to 951.5. Okay, and those contours update right with it. That was not what I wanted. I went up 950. I wanted to go up 1 or a half. Let's try that again. Raise lower. Let's go up 0.5. There we go. So everything attaches to this. I can move this pad around. The gradient objects attached to it. So the pad is kind of one entity then. So that's kind of the process for all of these. So I'm going to jump to a different drawing here. We're going to leap ahead a little bit, and we're going to have all these ones, except for the ones on the east side, completed here. And it's everything I just shown you. Maybe some different feature line styles on there, but the same concept. Okay. And then on the right side here, what we have is we've got a number of pads, but we don't have a corridor over here. So how do we come up with these elevations? Okay, I have some of them assigned, but let me go ahead and open up my layer dialog box and show you what we had done here. So I created a very basic feature line. Let me set the display order here so we can get that feature line. A feature line right there, okay? That's the right-of-way of the existing roadway. I drew a feature line right on top of it. I pulled elevations from existing grade, and that's where we're tying into. That's where the front of these pads are tying into. It could be any other things. We could daylight to existing or something like that, but right here I'm saying I'm tying into right-of-way. So I can drop a feature line there, and then from right-of-way, again, we want to assign pad elevations, some kind of typical or constant slope up from right-of-way. So what I've done is I've taken that feature line, I attached a very simple grading object to it. If I go through the editing of this grading option, you can see it's at a 5% grade down here, coming up at a 5%. And the distance we went was out there. So now I have a surface out there, and I can then grab all these feature lines and I can pull elevations from a surface that's based on elevations at existing right-of-way. Okay, so just another trick there, because we didn't have a corridor, but we wanted some way to automate that, some way to automate the assignment of these pad elevations. Let me jump to, let's take a look at the lots now. How do we fill in the lots? Let me back up a little bit here. So we've got all those pads graded. Now we have to grade the lots in between, and then of course the ponds as well. We're going to use the lot lines as our general guide for swales or grading in between the building pads, right? So we've got water coming away from the pads and then swales in between there roughly. So I've taken the exact parcel lines and I've copied those out of the drawing and I've brought those into here as just plain polylines. So if I turn that on, we can see all these red lines. These are all just basic polylines now. So since I have those, I'm going to go ahead and unload my XREF. And now we can see the lots as well. We're going to use these, we're going to turn these into feature lines and use these as swales and break lines in between our building pads and along our lot lines. So the fronts of these feature lines, they tie right into right-of-way. So how can we assign elevations right there? We can pull elevations from the corridor surface. Then what about the back of the lots? Well, if we pull elevations from corridor surface, I can then use quick elevation edit to do some typical slopes draining back to the pond. That will go right here, so 5–10% grades back. So here's what that'll kind of look like. I can pick all of these polylines, do a select similar, and if all at once I turn all of these into feature lines, I assign them to the same block, assign elevations, and we're going to pull elevations from the corridor surface. Okay. And if I go and look at some of these feature lines, one of the nice tricks about that command, elevations from surface, is it doesn't touch anything that's not within the corridor surface. It edited the elevation up here because that was under the corridor surface. So all of these tied in. Oh, that one missed a little bit. These will be little things you guys will run into where it doesn't quite tie in. We'll tie that in a second. But if we look at some of these other feature lines here, those are all tying in, okay? And then these ones down here, the elevations of that feature line, they're all at 0 because nothing was under corridor surface. So I'm going to do a few lots here and kind of show you what it would look like. I grab this feature line here and I use quick elevation edit up here. I come down and say a negative 10%. This one over here, perhaps negative 8% grade. If you guys haven't used quick elevation edits, it's a very invaluable tool. And then since I sent this grade, this is going to pull this one down, so we're sloping down at a negative 7.6 there. I can bring this one down over here, negative 10. Okay, so I'm setting these grades. Again, we could put some of those line elevation labels on here to call out grades at both ends. It could also call out slopes along the length of this. All sorts of ways we can use those labels to help us in this. So one of the nice things about this, when you set this up, these feature lines in between the lots or along the lot lines, these are going to be the ones you grade with quite a bit. The back of your lots, when you set up that feature line, set it up so there's vertices that tie in right at these lot lines themselves. So that as I move this feature line up and down, meaning I move that point up and down, this feature line will very easily move up and down with it. So the trick we're going to do here is we've got feature lines in the back of the lot, we've got lot lines along the edge here, then along right of way, we need a feature line along there. And what that's going to allow us to do is we're going to have these closed little areas, and we're going to be able to put infills in here. So let's set up some of this. Let's get a few lots to do this. So let's make sure a few of them are graded decently. It's a negative 10. Let's go negative 10 there. Yeah, so a few of these look pretty good here. And then on the front side, like I said, we need to pull the elevations from the edge of the corridor. And what we're going to do there is we're going to pull a feature line out of the corridor. I'm going to turn the border of my surface off so we can see that line more clearly. Okay, so this is the right-of-way line. If I pick on my corridor, there's a nice tool here called Feature Lines from Corridor. And what it does is it extracts the feature line from the corridor for me to use in other ways. So if I put it in the same site, this feature line will interact with my lot lines. I'm not going to turn on smoothing, and I'm also not going to turn on create dynamic link to corridor. That one works in theory, but you'll find in intersection areas that the feature lines aren't trimming and tying together nicely, and you have to do just a small amount of cleanup. And so I choose not to do the dynamic option. So I get a feature line there. I get one right there. And I go all the way around here. You can see the green line showing up. And I pull all my right-of-way lines out of here. And then what you're going to notice is that some of these don't touch. Occasionally the intersection tool, this is the way it builds. It's contouring fine in there. What we end up having to do is just add a couple extra pieces in here. In this case, I'm just going to draw a feature line manually, connect these 2 points. Then I can start joining these. So join that one to that one. Keep joining these all the way around here. So when you have different baselines in your corridor, that's where the feature line is going to end. So when you extract them, they're not necessarily going to be all one feature line. It's feature line there, feature line here. See if those will join. And right at the end here, I think we're going to get overlapping a little bit. So here's one feature line, the other one there. This is some of the cleanup I'm talking about that won't really allow you to leave it a dynamic feature line. So it's a nice trick. It works great when you're trying to target one corridor to another, for example, but not so great in this situation. So we get this feature line wrapped around the entire thing. It's pretty easy to pull out of the corridor. The way it's dynamic now, it's just a couple clicks. At any point, I can take this feature line and I can pull elevations from surface and update that if the corridor happened to change. So when I have this now, if I go to my grading creation tools, one of the great things about an infill, let me make sure I'm in the right site here, block one, block one. One of the great things about an infill is if you have any number of feature lines and grading objects, it'll just infill in that area. So I specified the pad, I specified the lot line in between, and now it's going to allow me to just infill in these areas. So what I'm starting to come up with here, if I take a look at this in 3D, I've got my pads up here. Here's my lookout or my walkout, and then there's my backyard. And we don't have a ton of detail in there, so you might say, well, what about the swales in between here? In between here, that may not be a constant grade. It might be a little flatter towards the front of the yard and then flatten out or get a little steeper back here. That's where we just put a little more detail in here. Grab this lot line, insert an elevation point. Let's drop one right here, one right there, so it's roughly flat there, and then one right there. Then I can manipulate these grades a little bit. So if we take a look at that surface in 3D now, we're going to see, just by putting a few elevation points in there, sorry, screen's a bit jumpy there, you can see more triangulation in there, and I start to have more control. Same goes for any of these feature lines, more control that you need between the lot line over here, perhaps an elevation point or two in there. But don't bother with that right away. I mean, start to get some rough numbers, get some rough volumes, and then start to go in there and get detail, get the detail taken care of. Okay. So again, I'm going to jump ahead. It's kind of the same procedure for all of these again. I'm going to jump ahead a bit to another drawing. I think this one has what I want. Okay. So here's that big feature line again. Okay, one little additional trick I had done is I drew a feature line right along here, right along existing grade. Okay, and then the feature line I extracted from my corridor, I put one little extra piece on it to tie into that feature line. And what that then does is close off this lot right here. And that allowed me to get this infill in here. Okay, so all those other ones work pretty well. These corner ones, they're a little tricky depending on how you end up finishing out your corridor. Okay, so this feature line along here now, this is just a constant grade along here. I could tie this into existing grade right here, or if I wanted to daylight from here and go daylight past the existing right-of-way, I could do that as well. So a number of options there, but this is how we're kind of tying it together. So let's look at the pond area in here. For the pond, I want to go from my back of lots, from the back of my lots, I want to offset a certain distance, and then I want to create my pond in there. So I'm going to take this feature line, I'm going to do a stepped offset. Okay, so that gives me a feature line. I'm going to explode this right away. Oops, exploded both of them. I want to explode this one. And that gives me a 3D polyline. If I look in properties, it's a 3D poly. That's what you get when you explode a feature line. I can then turn this 3D polyline into a 2D polyline. And I'm going to trim this up and put some fillets on it, and we're going to make a nice looking little pond in here. So if I trim some of this off, flatten both of these polylines, I should now be able to join those into one polyline. Okay, I'm going to run a fillet command on this, just basic AutoCAD fillet command, and trim that polyline up. So there's my pond, my starting point. This is all going to be in the same site, in the same block here. So let me go back to my grading creation tools, put myself in block 1, and I'm going to use just the basic grading criteria set. I'm going to do just basic grade to distance. Okay, so I'm going to do a fairly simple pond here. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the nuances of pond grading itself. Again, we have another webinar on that. But we're going to take this one and we're going to turn this into a feature line. So if I look at some of my surrounding grades here, I'm at 932 there, a lot higher, over 932 here, 29, 21, okay. So let's turn this into a feature line, and then we'll put that graded distance on there. So it's going into block 1. We're going to put it at an elevation of 927, we'll say. Okay. And we'll do a graded distance to the inside for the entire length, and we'll go a distance of 20 feet at a slope of -3. Okay. Do another graded distance. We'll put a small little bench on here. And then we'll put one more grading to finish this out. And here's what we're starting to come up with. Okay, so there's my pond in the middle. Some of those grades aren't quite right there. That's just some feature line editing to fix that up. But there's my pond in the middle, and then what do I have left here? All I have left here is a big feature line surrounding the pond and then the pond itself. That's no different than the lots with the building pad in the middle. So this infill option can work with this as well. I infill that. So what about some of these areas between the lots? Okay, we want a little more detail, maybe kind of a swale through here. I'm going to put a polyline on here. We'll go from right there. We'll just kind of come up here a little bit. We're going to turn that into a feature line. So if you throw a feature line in the middle of an infill, the infill will just grade right to it. So we're going to turn that into a feature line. We're going to assign elevations from the block 1 surface. So the exact surface that it's about to affect, we're going to pull elevations from that, but now it's going to be a constant grade, a swale of sorts that we have in there. And now it's forcing that in there. We can adjust the grade a little bit, come up at a 4% perhaps, and now we get a somewhat of a swale in there. Okay. If I take a look at this in 3D again, you can see our triangulation in there. Here's that swale we put in there. Not enough detail in there. Should it not be a constant grade? Okay, we have control, of course, on all of that. Drop an elevation point in here. And now I've got a point in there, and I can steepen some of it. Maybe this is a 6%, and over here is 2%. All kinds of control we have on this. Okay, so we've graded the lots, we've graded the corridor. We have one surface for that corridor. We have one surface over here. They're not completely linked. Like I can't just go and change the corridor right now. I can't change the center line profile, for example. That won't push to the lots automatically. But the magic link between them is this feature line right here. So let's make a change to this. Let's go to this street right here, and let's push the road up some. And we'll do it in this intersection area where the entire intersection will have to move up or down as well. Then we'll kind of see how we'll handle that. So let's go over to, here's that profile. Let's bring that up a touch, a few feet, so we can see substantial difference. Probably should have a vertical curve in there. But for these purposes, we're not going to put that in there. So what did that do? If I do that, that's going to affect this entire intersection. So first things first, I have to go to my intersection 5, and I have to update the regions and rebuild the corridor. So continue with the update. And that's going to rebuild the entire road there. And now if I take both of these two surfaces, what we're going to see just what we expect. The road came up and now the lots are all sitting down too low. Well, how did we set this up? We set it up so that the edge of the lots, the front of the lots, are based on a feature line pulled from the corridor. That feature line is draped or runs right along that corridor surface, so at any point we can pull elevations from the corridor surface and reassign that to that feature line. So if I go pick this feature line running along the whole perimeter of the corridor, I pull elevations from surface, we pull elevations from the corridor surface. I hit OK, go pick the feature line, and we assign all those elevations at once. Now there's another catch to this. This is often a sticking point for a lot of folks. Feature lines interact. If they're crossing and they're in the same site, they're supposed to assume the same elevation. Well, that's true, except it doesn't quite work the way you'd expect in this situation. So we assigned elevations along the right-of-way to the corridor surface, but those lot lines that come up here, those aren't necessarily connecting to vertices along that right-of-way feature line. So the lot lines are still sitting down low there. So what I mean by that, here's the right-of-way feature line, and then here's the lot line, okay? Unless there's a node or a vertex on this right-of-way feature line at the exact same place that the lot line is, that lot line is still going to hold, and it's going to pull that right-of-way feature line down. So what we have to do is we have to grab these lot lines again. I can pick them, do a select similar, and it grabs basically all the lot lines in my block. But it's only the endpoints that are going to be overlapping the surface, the corridor surface. So I can do a select similar, and here's a nice trick to do this, so we can assign a whole bunch of elevations at once to these feature lines without having to manually pick them. So I did the select similar. I go to the Modify tab, and I go to Feature Line, and I go to Elevations from Surface. The reason we do it this way instead of picking a feature line is because we want to remember our previous selection. So this is a little trick. I think one of the folks I learned this from is actually tuning in today, so I'm showing off your trick. So we're pulling elevations from corridor like this, and then now it says select objects. I say M for multiple, and then I say P for previous. And you can see down here it says 50 found. Every one of those feature lines are selected. I hit enter again, and it's going to assign elevations to all those feature lines, but it's only going to do it at locations that are underneath the corridor surface. So I hit enter, escape out of that now, and now these contours are tying in again. So definitely some cleanup there, but as far as tying in the lots to the road, we have that again, those lot lines. Oops, let me grab the road as well. Okay, so fronts of the lots tying in at right of way. Granted, we're not done here. Way more detail, of course, between these lots. But again, I'm just trying to show you guys workflow, how to build a model so that you can then go and do your detailed design with it. And that is the focus here. How do you set up a model to be able to do your design? We're certainly not done here. Some of these contours aren't quite cleaned up yet. We need more detail in here. We may even put some surface smoothing in some areas to clean up some of these contours. All sorts of detail we can do there. Lots of options. So zooming out a little bit, I turn on my XREF. How do you do this for a larger development? Okay. There's a limit to what you can put in a drawing, of course. And then there's behavior with sites and feature lines and infills. Okay. So for example, this area over here, this is completely surrounded by roads as well. This would be an entirely separate site, entirely separate surface, as would these perimeter lots as well. So we'd have 3 separate sites, 3 separate surfaces. For a limit of how much you could put in one drawing, putting all of this in one drawing, I would say it would be about the max limit, and that would be assuming you have a decent computer, and you're employing things like turning off surfaces and unloading XREFs, and you're freezing layers of objects that you don't need to be seen at that point in time. But that would likely make a pretty good sized drawing, but still workable. One of the greatest things that helps with performance is turning off corridor regions, for example. Hiding regions you're not using. A great tool. So none of that stuff builds, none of that stuff is processing in the drawing. Great way to handle performance. Okay. So that's kind of all I wanted to show you guys today. Again, it was focusing on the workflow, not the specific use of every little tool. We've got a number of webinars. I encourage you to go check those out that address a number of these tool sets. But this is about putting all those tool sets together to accomplish some residential grading.